Hello and happy Friday, or really whatever day it is that you are listening to this episode. Welcome to a brand new episode of From the Honeycomb. We are back after an amazing time off where we went to Belize, but more on that later. So welcome to From the Honeycomb, a podcast that creates a spark of positive energy in your home to design, architecture, yoga, meditation, and travel. I've created this podcast as a place to come for design inspiration and especially to learn about Vastu Shastra with a modern approach. I'm your host, Katerina and welcome to From the Honeycomb. Well, welcome to this week's episode of From the Honeycomb, where Jesse and I are sitting down to talk about the unBelizable trip we had to Belize. Jesse laughed, kind of smiled at that lame joke I made. So Jesse, welcome back to the podcast, and thank you for sitting down to talk to the listeners about our amazing trip to Belize.
Yeah, thanks for having me. As always, grateful to be here.
Thank you. And so as we begin every episode, we take a moment to kind of ground down and think of something we are grateful for. And whatever it is in this present moment, large or small. And so I think I'll go first. And what I'm really grateful for is obviously this trip. Because this trip was a much needed break, reset from some of the stresses of life. I had one of my architecture exams right before the trip, and unfortunately that did not go as planned. And so this trip was really just kind of give the opportunity for me at least to step away and just restart, reboot, relax, and just be outside in nature, and which we really did. We really were out in nature a lot. We saw so many amazing animals. So I would say this trip was much needed, and I'm very grateful for that.
And I'm grateful for this trip, grateful for having a life that we were able to take time out of to travel, and that we have careers that we really work hard at, but then also allow us to step away from. So that we're really fortunate for.
All right, well, let's jump into our trip to Belize. We're going to do this in two parts. So we're going to have a land episode, and on the land episode, we're going to talk about the part of the trip where we were on the mainland of Belize, what we did, what temples we explored. And then we're going to do next week's episode, which is going to be the water episode. And we're going to cover when we went to cacao, which is an island off the coast of Belize. And we'll talk more about that part of the trip in next week's episode. So we flew from California to Belize City via Houston, Texas, which I have to say this travel was pretty great. We left around midnight Thursday, and it was about a 3.5 hour flight to Houston. We got to Houston about 8 a.m. and then we flew to Belize City, which was another 2.5 hour flight. So really nice kind of transition. It was a little rough having the red eye, but it was good. We had no jet lag or anything like that. I think that's an hour ahead. I think Belize is about an hour ahead from California. So it's one of the reasons we like going to Central America is the time change. There isn't like when you go to Europe and you spend half a day not knowing what time of day it is. But yeah, so we landed in Belize City and rented a car to drive to our first stay, which was in Burelbum, which is about 30 minutes from Belize City and from the airport. And so we stayed there in this incredible house, and I think I'll pass it over to you for the house because you got to explore it more than I did because I slept a lot.
Yeah, flights were pretty uneventful. Everything was on time. We neither one of us really slept on the plane, either the plane legs. So it was a red eye. So that means we got to Belize pretty tired. It was a pretty short drive from the airport. The Airbnb was a little difficult to find only because there's just no street signs. There's no street name signs. And There was a little bit of communication translation issue with our host, but we did find it. It was on an unmarked dirt road pretty far back past several no private property and no trespassing signs that we weren't really sure if we were trespassing or not trespassing. But we finally saw the sign. It's the Howler house, referring to the Howler monkeys that are there in Belize. And so we figured, well, there can't be a lot of houses named that. So yeah, it was a great house. It was pretty much a one bedroom built up on stilts. So it was a flight of stairs up off of the ground. The lower level was just the stilts because it was literally right on the river. And when the rainy season, and if they have real torrential downpours, it keeps the house out of the flood area. So it was a really cool house. Had a nice small kitchen. Had a nice little bedroom with a mosquito net completely around the bed, which was nice. There was a screened in patio off the bedroom, and then there was a screened in patio off of like the little kitchen, living room area, dining room, and then an open patio that connected the two. And the open patio is the one that faced the riverbed. And yeah, it was a fun little house. Lots of hammocks. We did a little light cooking there. We were only there for one night, so we didn't really utilize the house as much as we would have liked to. We wanted to stay in that one again on our return leg, but unfortunately it wasn't available.
Yeah, no, this house was really cool. Like, it was unique, and then that night, well, we cooked a little when we arrived, but then we got really hungry, and our host recommended going down the road to a place called Iguana Stop, which was so worth going to. We had amazing, it's like a pork dish.
Yeah, it was like a smoked pork. Best way to describe it would be smoked pork in like a pico de gallo type salsa, where there's just fresh onions, fresh tomatoes, garlic, some spices, and just a bunch of ton of chips. And it was really good. And you could tell everything was fresh because they don't import. I mean, it was such a small area, such a rural area. There was nothing being imported there except beer and alcohol. That's the only thing that gets shipped into that place. Otherwise, the market we went to, which seemed to be the only market in the area, it had like a lot of a few things. Like it had a whole bin of onions, or it had a whole bin of Roma tomatoes, but it didn't have like 3 different kinds of onions and 4 different types of tomatoes, and it just didn't have that. It was just very, very rural. In fact, it took us a minute to even find cilantro because it's not a commercial type cilantro. That it's a type of cilantro where it still had the whole root ball attached to it. There was only a few baggies of the cilantro, and it's probably because most families just grow their own, so that it's not something that they would often buy from the store.
And you also found the cilantro in the fridge. It wasn't like just...
Right.
That was another thing we realized. When you go into a store, you have to open all the freezer, what are those, like freezer bins? Mm-hmm. Because that's where all your meats are, but there's no really order to it. It's kind of what's there is there, and all your meat is frozen. There wasn't any meat we found. Well, we ended up finding one place with like meat, but it was kind of weird.
And that was in Spanish Lookout. That was in still rural, but not jungle. The Burdio Boom was more just jungle area with sparse houses here and there with a small market. Spanish Lookout was more of a between rural and urban, I would say. So they actually had a market with like meats and things like that, where it was more where they had trucks, do deliveries and stuff.
Yeah. But yeah, this store was a little small, but yeah. But what was cool about the Iguana Stop, back to the first night's dinner, is the Iguana Stop did not disappoint with the iguanas.
Oh yeah, they were the biggest iguanas I've ever seen.
Huge. I mean, how would you even describe them? It must have been like, 3 feet long?
They were easily 3 feet long. I'd say the 2 biggest ones we saw were probably close to 4 feet from nose to tail.
Yeah.
Like just their body structure, just from head to hind legs, were like a couple of feet long.
Yeah.
Huge iguanas.
Like orangish, greenish iguanas. Mm-hmm. And then sitting there at dinner, so they kind of came up to all of us. They were more looking for just food if you dropped food. So then, I kind of freaked out a little bit. Jesse's like, no, it's okay. This is like their form of like a pigeon or something. It's like, it's okay. But like they just looked huge. So we definitely got to watch those. And then it was also cool. So where we stayed in Borobom was also on the Belize River. And the iguana stop was also right on the river as well. And so we got to see a crocodile.
Yeah, which is the whole reason we chose that Airbnb. There was a few selections to choose from, and Katerina said, oh, we can stay either in this place that has an alligator nearby or a crocodile nearby. And I was like, oh, that place. Like, if a place has a crocodile, that's where I want to stay, which I think we may have talked about before.
Yeah, I think we may have.
So when we got to our Airbnb, of course, first thing I did was went down to the river. There was a tree that grew over onto the riverbank, and Katerina was taking a little bit of a nap. So I'm like, well, let me climb out to this tree. So it went about 10 feet out onto the river, and it was just above, a few feet above the water. So I climbed out there and looked around for alligators, but it was about midday. Didn't see anything. Didn't expect to see, crocodiles. Didn't expect to see any crocodiles in the middle of the day. So then when we were at dinner, the Belize River is pretty slow moving. It hadn't rained, so it was pretty gentle, and the surface of the water was pretty smooth. We were watching all of these huge iguanas just crawling around just the whole restaurant area. And by restaurant, it's like a bunch of dirt, and then they had some plastic tables and chairs here and there. Super good food, great service, but it's not like a restaurant. It was so. Katerina's like, oh, is that an iguana swimming over there? Which we talked about, like, wow, I wonder if these guys swim or not. So we looked over, and it was not an iguana swimming. It was one of the crocodiles. And so I was super excited at that point, and we were pointing it out to some of the other guests having dinner, and a couple told us that, the crocodile, kind of hangs out here and there, and hadn't seen him in a few days. So that was super cool. They also did mention that the iguanas do swim in the river, which I was pretty surprised by since the river has crocodiles. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I was seeing a crocodile. It was not close to us. It was probably about 300 feet, 400 feet away, and then just swimming in the river, mm-hmm. like very slowly, just kind of partially probably just going with the flow, the flow of the river.
Yeah, so that started the trip off with iguanas and a crocodile, and then the following morning, again, I mentioned I kind of slept at this place too much. I just was exhausted coming off a busy work week and then jet lag. So then in the morning, though, Jesse, you had fun with some neighbors.
Yeah, so in the morning, I usually, even on the weekends at home, I'm usually up by 6. I don't sleep real well in the morning. So I was up having some coffee and watching. There's a lot of birds in the trees, and again, didn't have really tall trees, so trees were at the patio level, like the tree canopy was at the same level as the house. And saw a couple of toucans, saw several other birds, and I was kind of on the lookout for the iguanas because there was a large, what we thought was a large, more of a medium-sized iguana in the tree right next to us. So I was kind of on the lookout for them. I heard like the slapping of leaves. Like this one tree had big, flat, hard leaves. And I look over, and it was a whole troop of howler monkeys, probably 15 feet away, that were just making their way to that tree to start eating. So yeah, so they hung out in that tree for about 10, 15 minutes. There was a couple looked like large males, and then maybe half a dozen females. I think there's 2 babies with them. And they did, I guess what would be typical, monkey stuff. They hung by their tails and, kind of jumped from branch to branch. And then they slowly made their way, sort of 1 or 2 at a time, from one tree to the next. And I was just kind of watching them and drinking my coffee, and they were super quiet. You couldn't hear them at all other than the noise of the leaves. Other than that, you couldn't hear them at all. And so I was just watching, and I was really captivated by this one baby monkey. and it just seemed to be just having fun than eating. The rest of the troop was eating. And then I heard this really loud banging and running, and they had, instead of going around the house to get to the next set of trees, they started jumping on our roof, and we had a roof. The roof was just a metal tin roof, and so I jumped out of the hammock and started making my way through like 5 screen doors to get to Katerina, because she was asleep, and I was worried that she'd be afraid of, because she was on the other side of the house, so she's by herself. So all the monkeys just started clamoring across the roof. It was hysterical.
Yeah, and that was my alarm clock that morning. I was like, that must be, and I kind of figured it was monkeys, but still, like, it was huge sounds above our heads. And then, you came in, and so I got to watch the monkeys a little bit. I did a little yoga stretching on the patio. We had breakfast. You actually made a really great breakfast with, like, refried beans and some salsa. I think we made our own pico de gallo. Yeah. That was really good. We cooked more in the morning then. Mm-hmm. And then we kind of just packed up and had to head out because they were,
Before breakfast, or maybe just after? Oh, I think it was before breakfast. Like, the largest male howler monkey climbed onto our deck, and he was walking along the railing right behind me. And so I was trying to I got a little bit of a video of it, and then I got a picture of it, super blurry picture of him just right behind me. And so then I went back into the house, and I came out through the other side. He was still just hanging out on our deck, probably about 10 feet from me. And then I realized that I was like, oh man, I've kind of cut him off from where I was. I was in between him and the rest of the troop that had moved on to the next tree. And I was like, wow. So I started to back up to give him space to transit through. But he just went up this tiny, tiny little electrical conduit pole up onto the roof, and then went around that way, which I thought was super funny. But as we were packing up, I noticed there was a fairly large monkey poo on the deck. And after seeing it, I was like, I wonder how much monkey poo there is. And there was a lot. Not on our deck. That was the only one on our deck, but like looking at the trees and stuff around us, like, wow, they really...
Or the roof, probably.
Yeah, I'm sure the roof's covered.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was pretty... And then we think about that, we saw like, there's like a lot iguana poo. I was like, just there's so much animal life around us, and that there is so much excrement. But then that's why it's a forest. That's why it's a jungle, because it's just the cycle of the jungle, constantly fertilizing and eating fruit seeds, and then distributing the fruit seeds to other parts of the area. So it was really interesting.
Yeah, no, that place was really cool. That was a great start to the trip. So we made our way more west on the Northern Highway, which we were pleasantly surprised that it was all asphalt. Pretty much most of the roads, there were a few dirt roads we ended up taking, but very well maintained roads. And we ended up finding out that actually Belize gets money. They got a lot of money actually from the European Union a couple of years ago to upgrade all of their transportation. So a lot of the bus stops that you go past will have a little EU flag, and we kind of questioned that. And we ended up asking one of our tour guides, and he's like, I don't know why we got money from the European Union, but we'll take it.
Former colony.
It's a former
colony of England, when England used to be
part of the EU. Yeah.
So that's probably, the Queen's still on their money.
Yeah.
Probably came to them back during that period, maybe.
Yeah. So but still, it was kind of interesting how, it wasn't the British flag or the UK flag that was on there. It was the EU. So the EU does fund roads in Belize, we found out, which we thought that was kind of fun. But yeah, the roads were amazing. And as we were driving on the highway, we were on it for probably a good hour, but maybe 20 minutes into being on the highway, we see this police escort just like coming towards us in the middle of it's 2 lanes, one for, right side and left side, coming towards us. And we're like, what is that? So we pull over. And I guess it's very common. It's a common sport to do cycling in Belize. And so it was a cycle race. So, I don't know, maybe like 100 cyclists?
Yeah, more. Well, in that first group, there was maybe 60, 80, just in the first group.
and then stragglers throughout. But
Yeah.
so we had to wait, and then we ended up finding out from one of our tour guides is it sucks when you get stuck behind them because there's no way to pass them. So you have to just kind of keep with the group of the cyclists, and sometimes when you're trying to get across the country, which we were getting pretty much from the East Coast, the ocean, to almost the Guatemala border. That's quite a long stretch on the Northern Highway. So that was kind of fun to see the cyclists there, and we made our way to Spanish Lookout, which is a town probably like a half hour from San Ignacio, where some of the Mayan ruins are, and so we stayed there at an Airbnb, which unfortunately this Airbnb wasn't exactly as I had imagined. I definitely booked it more for the photogenic and Instagrammable appeal to the Airbnb, which I don't think I will ever do again. It was also the Airbnb we paid the most for, I think. I don't know if you knew that, but yeah. It was a unique Airbnb. They sold it off as it's a jungle niche, which after coming from the house in Burelbum, this house was in a very rural area, like farming rural, and then we went off this dirt road to this like cluster of houses and like cluster of trees, and then it seemed more like a man-made jungle than a natural jungle with a lot of animals. And so, but the house was cool. It was very uniquely designed. There was a lot of just interesting design aspects to it, but the functionality of it, we like to sleep with the windows open. Like in Burelbum, there was all screen windows everywhere. There was not one window you couldn't close. And so we ended up at this Airbnb that, if you like air conditioning, definitely stay there because the house is pretty much sealed. There were some operable windows in the lower level bedroom, which we ended up sleeping in, but it was cool. The one wall of the main living area was all glass, which was pretty cool to watch, especially when it rained or when you saw, you could look out at the jungle, quote unquote. But I think I was a little disappointed in that Airbnb.
Yeah, it definitely did. Whoever photographed it for, whoever the host, or if it was the host who photographed it, did a great job. It was very interestingly designed. It was not really an A-frame, but almost like an egg shape. It had just a pitched...
It's a Gothic arch.
Is it?
Where it's obviously wider at the bottom, and then it comes to a point. It's kind of like a Gothic arch.
Yeah, definitely arch, not A-frame. There's so many things that didn't work there. The cooktop didn't work. The espresso machine did not work. Mm-hmm. Luckily, the air conditioning worked. It had 3 air conditioners, which, as Katerina said, we would have preferred to use none of them.
It had 4.
Had 4?
One above the door, one up next to the door, one upstairs, and then one in the lower level bathroom.
That little portable one on the floor. Yeah, it just wasn't... I mean, we went and did fun things while we were there, but the Airbnb itself wasn't that great.
And didn't really have a place to sit and hang out, which we realized is something we definitely like when we have on our trips.
Yeah, it had 2 bedrooms, and then it had a dining area with 4 plastic chairs, and then that was it. So you either sat on a bed or you sat on one of the 4 plastic chairs. That was literally it for the inside of the house.
Yeah.
The outside had the hammock, which was super high, so it was kind of almost uncomfortable to get into. In fact, Katerina still owes me a beer. She's like, I will give you a beer if you can even get into that hammock. I mean, that's how like obnoxiously high it was.
Yeah.
And then 2 plastic lawn chairs on the deck. So there was 6 plastic chairs. That was the extent of sitting in the entire Airbnb. And it, although it was not really a jungle location, it was still thick in mosquitoes. So if you wanted to go hang out outside, you had to really douse yourself in some kind of insect repellent. Mm-hmm. So yeah, not the greatest area. It did have a super good fast food stop, not fast food, but a wings restaurant near, like literally 1 minute away. So we had some good food there. We had some good food at the Sisters,
yeah, the following night, which was Sunday, which we didn't think anything would be open, but we ended up having food at Sisters Diner.
Yeah,
but your food was really good. Mine was okay. I kind of went traditional Belizean, but I'd already had that, and it just felt like it was very repetitive, which was chicken, coleslaw, but you had fajitas that looked phenomenal.
Yeah, the fajitas I had were super good.
Yeah, for sure. And then, so back to Saturday, which was, we made it from Borelbom to Spanish Lookout. And I'm like, hey, we do have a full day tour on Sunday, but it's going to a different temple, different Mayan temple. It was actually a palace. So there's another temple in the area. Do you think we can make it? It's by the Guatemalan border. It's about 45 minutes from the Airbnb. And you said, sure, let's do it. So we drove towards San Ignacio, where we actually stopped at the market. They have a kind of a famous market. We did a little souvenir shopping. We bought some fruit there, huge papayas, the biggest papayas I've ever seen. Got some dragon fruit, which was really good for breakfast. And so we headed from San Ignacio Market to the Mayan temple of Xanantunich, which I believe I pronounced
pretty
correctly.
good, yeah. As best I can do it.
Yeah, thank you. And the fun thing about getting to Xanantunich was we had to take a ferry, which when I put the instructions in from San Ignacio Market to the temple, it showed a little boat symbol. And I'm like, what ferry is it? There's no ferry. There's barely a river. I'm like, why is it asking me to go on a ferry? And I had told Jesse a while back, promised him that we wouldn't have any ferries on this trip because when we went to Costa Rica a couple years ago, we had a disaster with a ferry, which we'll share eventually one day. But so I kind of said, hey, it says that we need to go on a ferry, but I don't understand. This place is 20 minutes away from the market. So we headed there, and there in fact was a ferry, but you just had to get from one side of the river to another, which was, it was 50 feet wide was the river. And so you got onto this little ferry thing, and then it was on a cable system, which one of their cables had snapped or something the day before, so they could only take 2 cars at a time. And then that took you to the other side of the river where you went up a road, and our guide got in the car with us, Dino, who was incredible, but he took us, he sat in the car with us, drove up to the main parking lot area, and that's where our tour started with him, where we went up slowly to the city and got to see, we started in the marketplace area of Xanantunich. We started in the market area, and Dino was so insightful. He could recollect so much of the information about what this structure we were looking at is, when was it found, by what professor, from what university, who found it, and just the chronological order and the information he had was really impressive. And so he walked us through the whole part of the city that has been uncovered, although there are some parts. There's actually one part that was being uncovered, and then COVID hit in 2020, and the team from, I believe it was Northern Arizona University. He seemed to mention that university a lot. So the team hasn't been back since due to COVID, but they were uncovering a lot of it. And he walked us through, told us what all the symbols meant, and just was really insightful to sharing what the Mayan civilization was, because I know I didn't really know much about the Mayans. I didn't really learn about them in school. I don't know if you didn't see
a little bit in university, yeah.
Yeah, but not very much. Obviously I know a lot about Europe and a little bit about Asian dynasties, but this was really interesting to learn about the Mayan temple and how the Mayans lived, and kind of why they abandoned the city as well, which sounds like it was due to drought and war. So that was really a beautiful, I'll post some photos on Instagram. I plan on kind of sharing our whole trip throughout the next few days and weeks. But this temple was just kind of a great overview of what the Mayan temples were and how the people lived.
Yeah, it was a really large city, and we got there towards the end of the day, and Dino, we were his only tour of the day. It had rained a little bit earlier in the day, and then nobody else had elected to take him up on his offer. So he's an independent tour guide, so as you pull up to the ferry stop, and the ferry is just a hand-cranked ferry, so cars pull on, the ferry operator just cranks the wheel and it pulls you across. So we were Dino's only tour of the day, and when we got there, actually walked up the slope with him, there was one couple. They were probably early 50s, late 40s.
Yeah, probably early 50s.
It wasn't that steep of an incline, but they had stopped probably about half the way up to catch their breath. Those were the last people we saw. We had the whole Mayan city to ourselves, and you'll see in our pictures, it's a large, I don't know how many acres the city was on, but when I say we had the whole thing to ourselves, we had this whole city to ourselves. We could go anywhere. Dino was telling us we didn't have to wait for, you want to be polite when somebody's taking pictures. You kind of stop and let them get their pictures in. We had no interruptions, nobody taking pictures, nobody else's discussions. It was just Katerina and I and Dino, and it was amazing. His depth of knowledge on subjects, not only his presentation, but in questions that you asked him. His depth of knowledge in answering questions was really impressive. Mm-hmm. So if you ever find yourself in Belize and the San Antonich city, you have the opportunity, look up Dino. If you can get a tour with him, you'll be glad you did.
Yeah, no, he was really insightful, and he also kind of came back to certain questions, because as he was telling us about how the Mayans counted, and what was really impressive is the amount of mathematics and astronomy that they were so knowledgeable in, because they built certain structures based on, because as we were walking through, I said, how do they orient the city, like how did they put this building where? And he said it was all astronomy. So everything was very symmetrical, which I thought was really interesting too. There was a part where we were standing in the market, and he says, you see these buildings, that they faced east and the other buildings faced west. And there's also a lot of stories about, throughout the day, the sun was... What animal was the sun? Nighttime was the jaguar.
Nighttime was a jaguar because it traveled the underworld.
And then the night... it wasn't a dragon? Oh, it was a bird. It was some sort of bird that wasn't local to the area. I remember something about that, I know. So there was just so much information we learned that day. It was, yes, I had no idea. But he talked about, the way the sun sets, and then the way you stand from one part of a building to another, the way you see the sunrise. He said, see this opening? This is for the winter solstice, and this is for the summer solstice, and this is for both of the autumn and spring equinoxes. And so what was incredible is they built all of these structures, not only all manpower, because the Mayans hadn't invented the wheel. They never came up with the idea of the wheel. So this was all done by manpower, and also everything was lined up and built according to astronomy and according to where the sun set or the sun rose, which I thought was incredible to hear. And then he also mentioned that the Mayans counted in counts of 20. And so I I said, well, I know the woman's cycle is 28 days. And so I said, Dino, I don't mind do you mind if I ask this question? I said, how did they work around the woman's cycle? And he said, that's a great question, actually. He said, there's the 20 days, and every 20 days a new set of 20 would start. So that was for the month. But then there's also a lunar calendar, so the moon calendar, which was a set of 26 days, actually, which is very close to the 28-day typical menstrual period. And so I thought that was really fascinating. And he's just like, no, that's a great question. And then he said, we talked a little bit about it later. He said, Katerina, how you mentioned the woman's cycle, there's also a goddess, which I forgot about, goddess Ishel, which was a Mayan goddess who represented fertility and the womb. And so that was kind of interesting. And he remembered, and he brought that all back. So it was really insightful with him and just really knowledgeable. I was really, really happy with him, for sure.
Yeah. Back to the Mayans and their building strategies. It was like Dino had said, that the Mayans had never invented the wheel, so they didn't have that to utilize in their construction techniques. But he said they also did not have any, what he called beasts of burden. They didn't have any ox or cows or horses. So they didn't have any of those animals' strengths to take advantage of for moving boulders, pulling trees down. So it was literally all manpower. It was just human beings doing this. The fact that these structures were built and had started being built in the 2 and 3 and 400 BCs was super impressive just for that date. But then the fact that these structures were built based off of the astrology that Katerina was just talking about, the part I found the most significantly amazing was that the Mayans had already mastered astrology by this point, because they had started building these structures 300, 400 BC, but when they started exactly based off of these lunar and solstice and equinoxes. Every single structure was laid out that way from the beginning. It's not like nowadays you can start building and then halfway through go, no, I'm just kidding. Oh man, we messed that up. We have to move this thing over. It's like they started building it exactly in the right spot, which means they had mastered that level of astrology before they even began to build. So who knows how many hundreds of years or thousands, of years before that point. It's just, I find that it just blows my mind.
No, it was incredible, and I'm so glad we made it to Chinantinich because that was really great. And that was a great basis for the following day. We had a tour booked ahead of time, which I'll provide a link in the show notes for all the Airbnbs we stayed in, all the restaurants, all the tours, everything. So if you guys are interested in booking with them. But we had a great tour guide that morning that picked us up from our Airbnb, Carlos, who was also very insightful, but on a different level. We learned a little bit more because we spent all day with him versus Dino, who we just spent, at Chinantinich with him. Yeah. And so Carlos picked us up. We had a full day tour booked with him through belizing.com. And we started the tour with driving from Spanish Lookout back to San Ignacio. There we had our first course, which was learning how to make chocolate and cacao, which was really cool. And I kind of knew a little bit about cacao and chocolate. I had made some years ago in St. Lucia. But this was very much interesting for me to learn about how incredible cacao was, how powerful cacao was for the Mayan culture. The currency they used was cacao beans. Yeah, cacao beans was a form of currency for them. They also made ceremonial cacao, which they would take cacao and grind it, which we got to practice grinding it on this. It was
a lava rock,
stone lava rock, kind of a big plate, and with this stone, not like a rolling, the rolling thing, the rolling pin, what's it called? Yeah, rolling pin. Yeah. And so we got to grind the cacao beans, and you could just see just how it was made, and then we drank the ceremonial cacao out of coconut shells. Coconut shells. And so that was really just amazing to hear how sacred the cacao was also, because you really only drank it for ceremonies, and it seemed like only the wealthy obviously could drink it because it was so so not expensive, but what's that word?
It was so rare because back in the Mayan days they rarely found the cacao tree, and one tree would produce one fruit. It's not like the cacao trees nowadays where they can farm it and one cacao tree, will give hundreds of fruits in one season. This was one tree would produce one fruit per season, per year. So if you imagine then how rare that would be to then go out and find these different trees, because then the Mayans struggled with cultivating this and bringing this plant back and trying to grow it, and then the plant would grow and never fruit, to learn how to pollinate, and it was a really, really difficult process. So the bean itself was very valuable because then they also had storage issues. They could get the bean, they could get the fruit, but then even if they could get it in quantities, then they had to learn how to store it in quantities, because then it would start to rot. And it was just trial and error. So by the time they perfected it, it was so difficult that it became a currency. It became a very sought after thing that only the wealthy could enjoy.
And it was only very ceremonial. It wasn't an everyday thing. Although, one thing that was interesting to learn about too is once the Europeans came and then they took the cacao back to Europe, and of course they added sweeteners, sugar, that kind of changed it, which our guide was really kind of impressed by us, where we didn't ask. He said, "Do you want honey in your cacao or anything like that, or do you want to just drink it raw as is?" And you and I both like bitter tastes. So that was actually really, I felt kind of like...
Yeah, because we took it from, Katerina and I took it literally from just the raw bean, and we ground it up, and we had help, and we got it pretty far, but we didn't, we got it down to where it wasn't bean anymore, but it has a natural oil, the cocoa butter, so we got it into a paste, but then they kept working on it, and it actually turned into like almost like a magic trick. They kept grinding and grinding and grinding and grinding, and then it turned into like Hershey's cocoa syrup, like just right in front of us. It was amazing just how it got to a certain point where when they were working the stone with just the right amount of friction and the right speed, it turned it into a liquid paste. And they would scrape that from the stone, and they put it into our coconut shells, and they added just some hot water, and that's what we drank. That's how we drank it. They didn't add tea or milk or
sugar.
Go and get something out of the refrigerator. It was hot water out of a kettle, and then the paste we had just made. But they would only let us take it to that point. So like Katerina said, he asked if we would want any honey in there to sweeten it, and we said no, thank you, we enjoy it the way it is. And he says, I'm very happy to hear that. That's how we enjoy it. But he did say that for them, the processing of the cacao is a religious experience, and that to the unordained, which obviously Katerina and I are not ordained in their religion, we were not able to taste the cacao in the way that they would perform it ceremonially. So we were able to, that's kind of like, we came to the point, they ground it down to the paste, and then they put it in the hot water for us, and then that's kind of that's the limit we could reach. They did bring us some chocolate that was prepared in a factory for us to enjoy and taste, something that's similar to what they would eat in their ceremonies, but it was not their actual chocolate that they make from the bean, because again, we don't meet their religious standards. And of course, we were absolutely fine with that. We wouldn't expect anything different, but I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. And another thing about this tour that was fun is we did everything. It was just us. It was just us in a classroom with this guy and this woman teaching us about cacao, which was really great. And then, throughout the whole day, it was just us really at all the ruins, and even at the next class that we took. So we ended up jumping in the car with Carlos, and we went a little further south into a Mayan village where we went to a women's collective center. There we got to make our own corn tortillas.
Yeah, they showed us how they take dried corn kernels. So this is like going back to the original Mayan culture of, you have to be able to, and the Mayan culture was huge, as we learned, was just tens upon hundreds of thousands of people in these cities. So that's a lot to feed. Like nowadays, most of us don't appreciate the logistics it takes to feed cities. Like we just go to the store, we buy what we want, we come home, we cook it, we go to the restaurant, we eat it. Back then, these cities were self-sufficient. They had to grow their own food, and even in off seasons, you had to have food for your people. So Cindy, who works at the Women's Collective, who was our guide through the day, she showed us how they take the dried corn kernel, and we boiled it in this pot where they add lime to it. To it, which helps a few things. It helps soften the kernel, and then it gets it to a point where you can peel the shell around each kernel of corn so then you're just left with just this sort of an engorged kernel of corn. So we had a bowl of those. You rinse that out really well, and then it's on this very similar stone grinding plate with sort of a long rectangular grinding stone. This one was made out of granite, where they did have off to the side, they did have a lava rock style one that they showed us. But this one, the one that we used for the corn, was with granite, and it had been passed down for many generations. And they said that's just how those stones are kept. They're made in the family, and then they just keep passing them down and down and down. But we ground the corn, and that was just using corn and then a little bit of water, and it was just grinding and grinding and grinding and grinding. And you scrape it all up back into a pile, and you come back up and you take a little bit and grind it and grind it and grind it. And we did really well at that. So to the point where we made our own corn tortillas, which were and they had a huge plate, a huge piece of pottery over an open fire. So they had the open fire and a cauldron, which is where we boiled the corn, and then this big pottery plate over the open fire, and that's what we cooked our tortillas on. And we ground the corn, and then we formed them down, pressed them down in tortilla shape, and they showed us how to seal the edges, which never really occurred to me. They had to seal that little thin edge around the edge of the tortilla, but then they showed us why. Put it on the pottery plate over the fire, and it would poof up, and they would kind of pat it and get the air to circulate until the whole thing was like a puffed pastry. And then we take it off the plate, and it would flatten back out, and they put a little bit of coconut oil, melted coconut oil, and a little bit of salt on the tortillas, and we ate those as a snack, and they were so good.
So good, so fresh. And they said a lot of like snacks for the Mayan children, or if they were running around all day or they were hungry, this is something that would be easily prepared for them, is just tortillas, which sounds like the woman from the morning they woke up. There was a woman who would make these little corn tortillas, and if anybody got hungry, they would stop by, a little coconut oil, salt, but it was very delicious.
Yeah, they because the cornmeal, what you call that dough, but the tortillas would not last. You may get tortillas to last a day, they said, but otherwise they just start to ferment. So every day it's taking that rock hard kernels of corn. Every day it's boiling that from, they start in the morning, they boil it, and they make the dough, and then then they make whatever tortillas they think they need for the day. And during that process, like Katerina was saying, the kids would come up, they would take that, and sometimes they may sprinkle a little spice in there, but then they take that tortilla while it's still fresh and hot, and they ball it up into like a little ball, and then that's what they give the kids to snack on, which is really cool.
Yeah, and so from that we went to another building where we got to make pottery, and both of us, for the first time, we got to sit at a pottery wheel, which of course they told us, back during the Mayan days, they didn't have pottery wheels. So what they did was they would take dough and roll it until it was almost like a snake shape, and then they would coil it into whatever vase, bowl, plate shape they needed, and then they would fill in the little gaps between the coils. But of course, with modern technology now, they use the pottery wheel, and so again, we were the only two, so we really got to sit down, enjoy, and what looks like a very relaxing task was actually very stressful. Very stressful sitting at the pottery wheel. I don't know if any of you have sat at a pottery wheel, but once you see someone who does it, who knows what they're doing, it looks so relaxing and wow, just gentle. You're just moving the clay with your hands, but the amount of pressure points you have to put, and you kind of have to know geometry and what you do when you do it, what it will affect the clay. And so that was really interesting, really fun kind of a thing we did. So that was good.
Yeah, that part was really fun. Yeah, and as I can't remember the guy's name off the top of my head now.
The gentleman who helped us. I have no idea.
But as he was finishing off his piece, because Cindy talked about what they do with their pottery, because it's an overall collective, so that they use it to sell souvenirs to help fund different enterprises for the different families in the community. So for them, making the pottery is a source of income. So when we sat down as he's finishing his first piece, and he's explaining as he goes, you put pressure here and you guide your hand there, and you kind of support, one hand supports the other, and this and that. And I said, wow, that looks so relaxing. I'm like, wow, I would get a pottery wheel for the garage, and just to go out and make pieces. And he kind of laughed. He said, yeah, I hear that a lot, that it looks very relaxing. Katerina went first, and man, it went from what looked like a very relaxing, sort of therapeutic, meditation-esque kind of activity. It turned into what looked like torture, like what you'd make somebody do. You're going to tell us this information, or we're going to make you make pottery. Yeah, it looked torturous.
Yeah, because I felt so bad, because when you mess up, they have to toss the clay to the side, and you had to start over. Because when my clay ended up being a blob, we had to start over again, which I felt really bad, because then they'll recycle the clay. They did recycle, of course, there was no waste. Yeah. But yeah, so that was a little intimidating. And so then from the pottery making course, then we sat down at lunch and had the best tamales I have ever had in my entire life.
Yeah, they were some amazing, same here, best tamales I've ever had. Some kind of chicken tamales, and there was a coleslaw.
And a sweet potato salad.
And a little green salad.
And a plantain chips.
Yep.
Those were really good.
And some awesome habanero hot sauce, like freshly made habanero,
Yeah.
which is not native to the region, but they incorporate now into their foods. And it was phenomenal food. Every single speck of food on my plate.
And then for dessert, which I was hoping to try some sort of Belizean dessert while we were out at dinner a few times, but nothing ever was on the menu. It was like, oh, maybe some ice cream or some chocolate cake. But we had, for dessert here, it was pumpkin, which I was surprised that they had, but it was sugar, like, what would you call that? That was
like a stewed
pumpkin.
Yeah, it was
in sugar.
Yeah,
it was really good.
Sugar and cinnamon. Yeah, I don't know, and I don't know if it was pumpkin. I know they said pumpkin, but I don't know if it was literally pumpkin or if it was just some type of gourd that had like a fleshy meat. But yeah, it was just you basically just use a spoon and just kind of scoop out this sugary, cinnamony, just deliciousness.
It was really good. It was really, really good. It was hard to not want to like ask, like, can we go lay in a hammock for a little bit? But from there we headed to the Mayan palace of Cajalpeche, which was just a little heading towards back east on the northern highway in San Ignacio. And this palace was the main palace. It was associated kind of with Shenantinich, but it wasn't. No, it wasn't. Yeah, that's right. No, it wasn't. So there were, even though these two like ruins were about, let's say, 30 miles from each other, they weren't exactly associated. So the Shenantinich was a village, and back to that is they found the body of a woman in one of the ruins, and it looked like she was a queen. They didn't identify who she was or what her name was. But she was in a very royal, burial. She had a really royal burial. So then in Cajalpeche, we saw the palace. And there, it was kind of, there were little marketplaces. And, Carlos showed us this is where the lower class would be, middle class. But then this is where the palace was. This is where their parliament, trading, administrative, everything was kind of in this palace. And we got to see the palace bedrooms. We got to see where the king would sleep, where he went to meditate. And also this palace was built on astrological layout where, yes, if you stood here and here, this is where you would see the sunrise during the summer solstice, the winter solstice. And so coming from Shenantinich to Cajalpeche was definitely a more intimate experience. We got to see really what the day of a life would be for the king and where his quarters were and how you would move through the spaces. And what I really liked, what Carlos did, was we would get to the top of one of the structures and we would look out, or he said, and this is where the king would sit and the administrators would come, or people would come with trades. Now sit and think and just imagine what that all looked like. And so it really took a lot of moments throughout the whole palace, walking through the ruins, imagining what the day-to-day life was. And how, he said, and this is where the market would be, and here's who would be seated here. And it was pretty spectacular, I would say. I'm glad we did both of the ruins.
Yeah, the palace was really interesting. Talk some more about the fall of the Mayan Empire and kind of how they started progressing to more and more drastic measures to end the drought. And obviously, Katerina and I, living in Southern California, we're familiar with what drought means. Although to us it means higher prices for water. It means restricted days for irrigation or more stricter building codes. But in the Mayan days, it meant an entire civilization is at risk, and that's to everybody we talk to's best estimate is the drought led to war. The war led to just mass abandonment of these cities and temples. To at the end where the lower classes lost faith in the upper class, because the upper class, in those days were kings and queens and priests and astrologers, and all of them would be, all of these upper class people would say, oh, all we have to do to bring the rain is do this, this, and this.
Pray to this God.
And then so the people, the lower class would do this, and this, or they'd make the sacrifices, or they'd bring, they would do this, do that, and then when it just didn't work anymore, that there was a peasant uprising. And that led to war, and it led to abandonment of the cities. That was pretty impressive.
That was. No, and it was interesting too is you couldn't, Carlos said you couldn't move through the classes. Because I said, what if someone in the lower class showed to be really intellectual, really smart? Then what usually happened to those people, or if it was someone in the middle class wanted to get to the upper class, is someone from maybe the upper class would see someone in the lower class, showing a lot of potential and say, oh, you know what? The gods are asking that we sacrifice you for whatever reason. And so then they would kill the person off. That way they couldn't, raise through the ranks or possibly cause revolution, anything like that, or revolt. And so that was kind of interesting to hear is their excuse was, well, a god needs you. A god asked to sacrifice you, and then we'll have rain, or we'll have food, or we'll have whatever. So it was kind of brutal, but
it wasn't also, it always wasn't about insecurities of the upper class. Just, it was a culture and a time where, one, they believed in the next life. So it wasn't always a punishment or retribution. Sometimes it was looked at as a transition. So, because we talked about, some of like the Mayan games that they played. We went to a few ball courts, and there's some evidence that when teams would play against each other, the losing team would be sacrificed to the gods. But then there was also a lot of evidence that showed the captain of the winning team was the one who was sacrificed as a reward. He was sacrificed to go to the next life, to be that next, reincarnation into that next life form. In some cases, when they used the word sacrifice, it was a positive thing. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I thought it was just a different mindset. And I think that's one thing that Dino talked about, which I'm not the most religious person, and so I've often had this thought too. But one thing Dino pointed out is he said, hey, when you have 10,000 people and you're the upper class and you need to control them, you need a means of control. And he's like, and the Mayans, used the gods and said this god needs this and that god needs that, and then that's how they ruled those people. They didn't have, that was their law. Mm-hmm. They didn't have a law that says you can't murder somebody. They didn't have a law that says you can't speed. There wasn't a book of laws. The law was, there's these gods, and if you don't do what we tell you to do, if we don't tell you what the gods want you to do, and you don't do that, there's going to be famine, or your whole family's going to die, or whatever. So it was interesting.
No, that absolutely was interesting. And so that pretty much kind of sums up our land, because then the following day at the end of this tour, we went back to Spanish Lookout to stay at our Airbnb. I guess to conclude, we had quite a eventful evening that night, where in the middle of the night, we heard some sort of I heard this noise, and I kind of woke up Jesse. I said, Jesse, because we had windows open because we wanted some fresh air, and it was only screens protecting us, from the outside. And I said, I hear some noise. And so Jesse woke up, and, you listened, and it was this weird, just I can't even explain. It was this just crazy howl with a hoo at the end. Yeah, it was this howl with a hoo, and we're just what is that? So we ended up closing up the windows, turning on the AC, because we're I don't know what could come through those screens, which we ended up finding out it was a howler monkey.
Yeah, that's what we thought. But the howler monkeys we saw in Budio Boom were just so quiet and small. This thing was unbelievably loud. Just to the point where it filled the entire area. It was deafening. It was so loud. Yeah. And if you really want to know what it sounds like, just go into YouTube and search on Belize howler monkeys and listen. And I say Belize because they sound different in different regions. We had howler monkeys in Costa Rica, and when I was looking this time, I wonder, just to see for sure that's what it was. They don't sound the same in different regions, but if you look up Belizean howler monkeys, that's what it was. It was unbelievably, it was unbelievably loud, and I don't know if they were 10 feet away or 1,000 feet away. Well, they weren't 1,000 feet away. They were in the trees around us. I outside of our window was our car. So I even like locked and unlocked our car so the lights would come on and flash. The car doesn't make like your classic beep when you locked it. This car, like when you lock it, it flashes the lights and then folds the side mirrors closed. It was a Kia Sportage. So it didn't beep, but it did make a bunch of flashing lights. Didn't phase the Howler monkeys, not even a little bit. Like mid-howl, they didn't slow down, stop, pause, nothing. They just did not care.
Mm-hmm. No, they didn't. But so that was an eventful night. But yeah, I think this concludes our land portion of Belize. And yeah, if you tune in next week, we're going to talk about our trip to Cacao, which is an island off the coast of Belize, and the incredible animals we saw there. We even snorkeled with some manatees. So yeah, if you like this episode, please give it a heart or thumbs up and click the follow button so you can stay up to date on the latest episodes. And follow me on Instagram at From the Honeycomb Podcast. Thank you again for listening, and see you next Friday.